Welcome to Marple Parlor. I'm Maddox Hale. Pull up a cozy chair by the fire, dear listeners, and let's embark on a chilling tale of intrigue and deduction. Today we're unraveling Corpse at the Snowgate Waystation, a Miss Marple murder mystery, inspired by the timeless style of Agatha Christie. This is a long one, perfect for those snowy evenings or late-night relaxes, so settle in with your favorite blanket and a hot cuppa. I'll be your guide through this 1920s whodunit, speaking in that warm, deliberate way to help you unwind. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, perhaps a bustling city or a quiet village like St. Mary Mead. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. It was the winter of 1927 and the Yorkshire moors were bracing for a blizzard that would soon blanket the land in icy isolation. The Snowgate Waystation, a sturdy stone inn perched on the edge of this desolate expanse, stood as a beacon for travelers crossing the treacherous pass. Its weathered walls, etched by centuries of wind and frost, held stories of lost wanderers and fleeting refuge. The inn's great oak door groaned under the weight of the wind, and its leaded windows glowed faintly against the gathering dusk, promising warmth within. Tonight, however, this haven would become the stage for a drama far darker than any tale whispered by its ancient hearth. Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming spinster from St. Mary Mead, had not planned to linger at Snowgate. At 74, with her sharp blue eyes peering through delicate spectacles and her slight frame bundled in a sensible woolen coat, she appeared every inch the harmless auntie, her hands busy with a half-finished scarf. She was en route to London to visit her nephew Raymond, having chosen a northern train to avoid the holiday crush. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as the carriage rattled through the whitening landscape, and she murmured to herself, "One never expects the weather to turn quite so fierce, does one?" Those who underestimated Miss Marple, however, did so at their peril. Beneath her gentle demeanor lay a mind that unraveled human nature with the precision of her stitches. The Waystation's proprietor, Mr. Elias Snowgate, greeted his guests with the gruff efficiency of a man who had seen countless storms. A burly figure in his 50s with a beard as white as the drifts piling outside, he moved with the authority of a captain commanding a ship. His family had owned the inn for generations, and he maintained it with meticulous care, from the polished brass lanterns to the crackling fire in the great hall. "Storm's comin' fierce tonight," he rumbled, ushering the travelers into the hall, where the scent of pine logs mingled with mulled wine. Heavy oak beams loomed overhead, and faded tapestries depicted hunts long forgotten, their threads worn but vibrant in the firelight. The first to arrive was Lord Reginald Harrington, a pompous aristocrat whose wealth was matched only by his self-regard. In his late 60s, with ruddy cheeks and a booming voice that filled the room, he carried the air of a man accustomed to command. His fortune, built on colonial investments in Africa and India, was a frequent topic of his conversation, delivered with a flourish of his gold-tipped cane. "This inn's a bit quaint, isn't it?" he remarked, adjusting his monocle as he surveyed the rustic surroundings. His much younger wife, Lady Evelyn Harrington, trailed behind him, her elegance a stark contrast to his bluster. At 35, with raven hair pinned in an intricate chignon and a string of pearls gleaming at her throat, she moved with the grace of a dancer. Her green eyes, however, held a flicker of boredom as she sighed, "Darling, must we stay in such a provincial place?" Accompanying them was Miss Clara Vickers, Lord Harrington's secretary, a woman whose unremarkable appearance belied her indispensable role. In her 40s, with pinched features and mousy brown hair tucked into a severe bun, she clutched a leather notebook as if it were a shield. Her eyes darted nervously and her thin lips pressed tighter each time Lord Harrington barked an order. "Clara, do see to the luggage," he snapped, barely glancing at her. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the notebook, which contained the meticulous details of his sprawling business affairs. Next came Dr. Arthur Thorne, a Harley Street physician whose reputation had once shone brightly but now flickered under whispers of scandal. Tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a doctor's bag that never left his side, he was traveling to a medical conference in Edinburgh. His tailored overcoat and polished shoes spoke of prosperity, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he accepted a glass of port from Mr. Snowgate. "A bit of snow won't keep me from my duties," he said with a forced smile, though a crumpled telegram in his pocket hinted at debts that dogged him. Colonel Horace Blakely, retired from the Indian Army, strode in next, shaking snow from his greatcoat like a bear emerging from hibernation. A bluff man of 60 with a weathered face and a scar slashing across his left cheek, a memento of some colonial skirmish. He carried himself with military precision. His gray eyes scanned the room, lingering on Lord Harrington with a hint of frost that suggested an old acquaintance turned sour. "Reginald still talking about that blasted lion hunt?" he said, his tone clipped as he warmed his hands by the fire. The final guest was Mr. Julian Langdon, a young artist in his mid-20s, whose arrival on foot from a nearby village raised eyebrows. His tousled brown hair and paint-stained fingers marked him as an eccentric, and his threadbare coat suggested a life of passion over profit. "The moors are a canvas of their own," he said, his voice light but his eyes sharp as they flicked toward Lady Evelyn. He carried a sketchbook, its pages filled with charcoal studies of windswept landscapes, and perhaps other inspirations. "One finds beauty in the most unexpected places," he added, accepting a room with a charming smile. As the group gathered for dinner in the Waystation's dining room, a cozy space lined with brass lanterns and shelves of dusty tomes, the storm outside grew fiercer. The windows rattled and snow pressed against the panes, sealing them in. Mr. Snowgate's sole maid, young Bessie, served a hearty meal of roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and steamed vegetables, her hands trembling slightly under the weight of the trays. The fire cast long shadows across the table where the travelers sat, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. Lord Harrington dominated the conversation, regaling the group with tales of his safaris. "Shot a lion once clean through the heart," he boasted, his voice drowning out the wind. Lady Evelyn toyed with her pearls, her smile polite but distant, her gaze occasionally meeting Mr. Langdon's. Miss Vickers scribbled in her notebook, her face pale as she endured her employer's occasional jibes. Dr. Thorne spoke of medical advancements, but his fingers drummed nervously, and Colonel Blakely's scar twitched when Harrington mentioned a shared past in Bombay. "Old times, eh?" the colonel muttered, his tone suggesting anything but nostalgia. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, observed it all. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes missed nothing. The tension in Colonel Blakely's jaw, the way Lady Evelyn's fingers lingered near Mr. Langdon's napkin sketch, the faint crumple of Dr. Thorne's telegram as he shifted in his seat. "People are like snowflakes," she thought, her lips curving slightly. "Each one unique, yet so easily melted under the heat of scrutiny." She sipped her tea, noting the way Mr. Snowgate watched his guests, his own expression guarded. As the clock struck 9, the wind howled louder and the snow piled higher against the doors. "No one's leaving tonight," Mr. Snowgate declared, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The travelers exchanged uneasy glances, their fates now bound to the Waystation and each other. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind already weaving the threads of their stories. "A storm brings out the truth," she mused, "whether people wish it or not." Word count 2000, Chapter 2. Shadows in the Snow. The evening meal at the Snowgate Waystation unfolded in the dining room, a haven of warmth against the blizzard howling outside. Brass lanterns cast a golden glow across the oak-paneled walls, their light dancing on shelves lined with dusty, leather-bound books, some so old their titles had faded into obscurity. The air carried the rich aroma of roast beef and mulled wine, mingling with the faint tang of wood smoke from the massive fireplace that dominated one end of the room. The travelers, thrown together by fate and foul weather, sat around a long table set with mismatched china, their faces betraying the unease of strangers forced into close quarters. The windows rattled as gusts battered the inn, and snow pressed against the panes, sealing them in like figures in a snow globe. Lord Reginald Harrington, ever the commanding presence, held court at the head of the table, his ruddy face flushed from port and pride. His booming voice filled the room as he recounted a hunting tale from the African veldt. "The beast charged, but my aim was true," he declared, gesturing with a fork as if it were his rifle. His monocle glinted in the candlelight, and his gold-tipped cane rested against his chair, a symbol of his self-proclaimed importance. Lady Evelyn Harrington, seated beside him, traced the rim of her glass with a manicured finger, her raven hair catching the firelight. Her smile was polite but strained, and her green eyes wandered, settling briefly on the young artist. Mr. Julian Langdon, who sat across from her, sketching idly on a napkin. Miss Clara Vickers, Lord Harrington's secretary, sat primly to his left, her notebook open but untouched as she endured his occasional barbs. "Clara, do stop scribbling and pass the potatoes," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. Her pinched features tightened, and her hands, pale and trembling, complied without a word. Dr. Arthur Thorne, the Harley Street physician, sipped his wine with a forced air of calm, though his lean frame seemed taut, and the telegram in his pocket, a demand for payment on gambling debts, crinkled faintly when he shifted. Colonel Horace Blakely, retired from the Indian Army, sat ramrod straight, his scar twitching as Harrington mentioned a shared history in Bombay. "You always did exaggerate, Reginald," he muttered, his gray eyes narrowing. Mr. Langdon, the artist, offered a disarming smile as he sketched, his tousled hair falling over his brow. "The Moors inspire such dramatic scenes," he said, his voice light but his gaze lingering on Lady Evelyn. She returned a faint smile, her pearls gleaming as she leaned slightly toward him. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly at the table's end, observed it all with her mild, bird-like gaze. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, crafting a scarf that grew longer with each passing minute. "People reveal so much when they think no one's watching," she thought, noting the tension in Colonel Blakely's jaw, the way Miss Vickers' fingers clutched her fork, and the fleeting glances between Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon. The meal progressed haltingly, lubricated by Mr. Snowgate's generous pours of port. The inn's proprietor moved about the room with the efficiency of a man accustomed to storms, his white beard and weathered face giving him the look of a seafarer stranded on land. Young Bessie, the maid, darted between the kitchen and dining room, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire and the weight of her duties. She set down a steaming dish of Yorkshire pudding, her hands trembling slightly as she avoided Lord Harrington's imperious gaze. "More wine, girl," he barked, and she scurried to obey. As the clock on the mantel struck 10, the wind's howl grew fiercer, rattling the windows with a force that made the candles flicker. Mr. Snowgate stood, his shadow looming across the table. "Storm's too wild for travel tonight," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You're all staying put." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their plans thwarted by the blizzard. One by one, they retired to their rooms on the upper floor, reached by a creaky staircase that groaned underfoot. The Waystation had 6 guest chambers, each with a sturdy oak door and a brass lock that gleamed in the dim light of the corridor's sconces. Lord Harrington's room at the end of the hall overlooked the snow-swept moors, its windows framed by heavy velvet curtains. Miss Marple, in her modest room with its simple iron bedstead and quilted coverlet, paused her knitting to listen. The inn was alive with small sounds, the creak of floorboards, the distant clink of glass as Bessie tidied the dining room, and faintly the shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. They were soft, furtive, pausing briefly before a door creaked open and shut. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Someone's restless tonight," she murmured, her fingers resuming their rhythm. Outside, the blizzard raged, the wind screaming like a banshee across the moors. She glanced at her window where snow had piled high, sealing the frame in a wall of white. Sleep came fitfully to the Waystation's guests, the storm's fury a constant companion. But it was not the wind that shattered the night's uneasy peace. At dawn, as the first gray light filtered through the snow-laden windows, a piercing scream tore through the inn. It was Bessie, her face ashen as she stood outside Lord Harrington's door. The other guests stumbled into the corridor, bleary-eyed and alarmed, their nightclothes hastily covered by robes. Mr. Snowgate, roused from his quarters below, thundered up the stairs, his nightcap askew. "The master's door, it's locked!" Bessie cried, her voice trembling. "I knocked, but he didn't answer, and when I looked through the window—" Her words dissolved into a sob. The group crowded around the small window beside the door, its panes frosted but clear enough to reveal a chilling sight. Lord Harrington lay sprawled on the floor of his room, his nightshirt stained crimson. A dagger, an ornate antique from the inn's dining room display, protruded from his chest, its hilt glinting in the faint light. Blood pooled on the carpet, dark and stark against the faded pattern. His monocle lay shattered beside him, and his face was frozen in a rictus of shock. Mr. Snowgate tested the door, finding it bolted from the inside, the key still in the lock. He peered through the keyhole, confirming the bolt was engaged. The window, buried under a foot of snow and sealed tight by ice, showed no signs of tampering. "How in blazes," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold air. Lady Evelyn let out a dramatic cry and collapsed into Mr. Langdon's arms, her pearls clattering as she sank. Dr. Thorne pushed forward, his doctor's bag in hand, but his face was pale. "Let me see," he said, though his voice wavered. Miss Marple, arriving last, stepped quietly into the corridor, her shawl draped over her shoulders. "Dear me, how dreadful," she said softly, her eyes scanning the scene with calm precision. She noted the undisturbed snow outside the window, the key in the lock, and a faint smudge of ash on the hearth visible through the glass. An impossible crime, it seems, she thought, her needles tucked safely in her bag. The room was a fortress, door bolted, windows latched and snowbound, no secret passages or hidden exits. How had the killer entered and escaped? The group stood frozen, their breaths visible in the chilly air as the reality sank in. Lord Harrington was dead, murdered in a locked room, and one among them was a killer. The storm outside roared on, trapping them in the Waystation with a mystery as cold and unforgiving as the snow itself. Chapter 3. The Veil Lifts. The scream that shattered the dawn still echoed in the minds of the Snowgate Waystation's guests as they gathered in the great hall. The fire, stoked anew by Mr. Elias Snowgate, crackled fiercely, but its warmth did little to thaw the chill of fear that gripped the group. Lord Reginald Harrington's body lay upstairs, a dagger in his chest, locked in a room that seemed impenetrable. The blizzard outside howled with unrelenting fury, piling snow against the inn's stone walls and sealing the windows in a frosty embrace. The local constable, miles away in a snowbound village, was unreachable, leaving the travelers to face the grim reality. A murderer was among them, and they were trapped. Mr. Snowgate, his white beard bristling with agitation, had forced open Lord Harrington's door with a shoulder charge, the oak splintering under his bulk. The room revealed its secrets in stark detail. Harrington sprawled on the blood-soaked carpet, his nightshirt crimson, the ornate dagger, taken from the dining room's display, buried to the hilt in his heart. His shattered monocle glinted beside him, and his face, frozen in shock, stared blankly at the ceiling. The key remained in the lock, the bolt engaged, and the windows, buried under drifts of snow, were latched tight, their frames sealed by ice. No footprints marred the snow outside, and the room's walls, thick and unyielding, held no hidden panels. It was a locked room, an impossible crime, and the guests' faces mirrored their disbelief. Lady Evelyn Harrington, her raven hair disheveled and her pearls askew, clung to Mr. Julian Langdon's arm, her sobs theatrical but her eyes sharp. "Who could do such a thing?" she wailed, her voice trembling as she pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips. Mr. Langdon, the young artist, supported her with a gentleness that seemed almost too attentive, his paint-stained fingers lingering on her elbow. Dr. Arthur Thorne, the physician, knelt beside the body, his doctor's bag open at his side. "Stabbed clean through the heart," he pronounced, his voice steady but his hands betraying a faint tremor. "He's been dead since midnight, I'd wager." Colonel Horace Blakely paced the room, his scar twitching as he muttered about foul play and cowardly acts. Miss Clara Vickers, the secretary, stood frozen, her notebook clutched to her chest, her pinched features pale as chalk. Miss Jane Marple, arriving last in her sensible woolen coat, surveyed the scene with her characteristic calm. "Dear me, how tragic," she said softly, her blue eyes darting from the blood-stain to the ash smudge on the hearth, from the key in the lock to the undisturbed snow outside the window. Her knitting bag hung at her side, a quiet reminder of her unassuming presence, but her mind was already weaving patterns from the chaos. A locked room is only a puzzle waiting to be solved, she thought, her lips pursing slightly as she stepped closer to the body. Colonel Blakely, his military instincts taking over, declared himself in charge. "We'll sort this out ourselves until the constable arrives," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of the parade ground. But Miss Marple, with a gentle tilt of her head, suggested they gather in the hall to discuss matters over tea. "A clear head is best for such things," she said, her tone mild but firm. The group, reluctant but cowed by her quiet authority, complied, descending the creaky staircase to the great hall where Bessie, the maid, shakily prepared a pot of Earl Grey. The hall's fire roared, casting long shadows across the oak beams and faded tapestries. The guests sat in a tense circle, their cups clinking against saucers as they eyed one another with suspicion. Mr. Snowgate stood by the door, his burly frame blocking any thought of escape, though the blizzard made such notions futile. Bessie hovered nearby, her apron twisted in her hands, her eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, sipped her tea and let her gaze drift over the group, noting the way Lady Evelyn's fingers tightened around her cup, the nervous tap of Dr. Thorne's foot, and the way Colonel Blakely's scar seemed to pulse with his agitation. "Let us be frank," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the silence like a needle through cloth. "Lord Harrington was not a man without enemies, and we must consider who among us might have wished him harm." Her words, delivered with the gentle cadence of a village gossip, landed like a challenge. The group shifted uncomfortably, their secrets teetering on the edge of exposure. Lady Evelyn spoke first, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Reginald and I had our disagreements, as all couples do," she admitted, her eyes flicking to Mr. Langdon. "He could be controlling, especially about money, but I loved him." Her claim rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted the way her pearls caught the light, a reminder of the wealth she stood to inherit. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat, his mustache twitching. "I owed Harrington a sum, a loan, nothing more," he said, his hands folding tightly to hide their tremor. "He was pressing for repayment, but I'm a respectable man. I'd never resort to this." The telegram in his pocket, glimpsed by Miss Marple's sharp eyes, suggested otherwise. Colonel Blakely's voice was gruff, his scar stark against his reddening face. "Harrington and I crossed paths in Bombay years ago," he said. "He accused me of cowardice during a skirmish, ruined my reputation. I won't deny I despised him, but I'm no murderer." His fists clenched, betraying a rage that simmered beneath his discipline. Miss Vickers, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke next. "I worked for Lord Harrington for 15 years, she said, her eyes downcast. "He was demanding, cruel at times. He paid me poorly and threatened to dismiss me if I ever spoke out. But I needed the work." Her fingers tightened around her notebook, its pages filled with years of silent resentment. Mr. Langdon, his artist's charm undimmed, leaned forward. "I barely knew the man," he said, though his eyes lingered on Lady Evelyn. "We spoke at dinner, and yes, I admired Lady Evelyn's spirit. Perhaps that caused tension, but murder? Preposterous." His sketchbook, resting on the table, held drawings that Miss Marple suspected were more than mere landscapes. Even Mr. Snowgate, prodded by Miss Marple's gentle prompting, admitted a grievance. "Harrington stayed here before," he said, his voice low. "Ran up a bill he never paid. Said he'd settle it with influence, but it was all talk. Still, I run an honest inn. I'd not kill a man over coin." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking faintly as she drew a skein of wool from her bag. "Motives are like threads," she thought, her eyes narrowing. "Each one leads somewhere, but only one weaves the truth." She noted the way Lady Evelyn avoided her husband's name, the defensive edge in Dr. Thorne's voice, the barely concealed fury in Colonel Blakely's posture. Mr. Langdon's charm seemed too polished, Miss Vickers' quiet too deep, and Mr. Snowgate's gruffness too guarded. As the tea grew cold, the group's accusations began to surface. Colonel Blakely pointed at Dr. Thorne, citing his debts. Lady Evelyn suggested Mr. Langdon's flirtations had provoked jealousy. Miss Vickers remained silent, but her eyes darted nervously. Mr. Snowgate muttered about outsiders, though the snow made that impossible. Bessie, bringing fresh scones, whispered to Miss Marple that she'd heard a thump in the night, but thought it was the storm. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the ash smudge on the hearth, the key in the lock, the sealed windows. "An impossible crime requires an impossible mind," she thought, her fingers pausing on her knitting. The hall grew quieter, the fire's crackle the only sound as suspicion settled over the group like snow, heavy and unrelenting. Chapter 4: Whispers of Deception. The morning dragged on at the Snowgate Waystation, the blizzard outside showing no mercy as it piled snow against the stone walls, sealing the inn in a cocoon of white. Inside, the great hall had become a stage for suspicion, its oak beams and faded tapestries bearing witness to the uneasy gathering of guests. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of those seated around the heavy oak table, their teacups long cold. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, hung over them like a spectre, and the absence of the local constable left them to sift through clues and accusations themselves. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, sat quietly, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she observed the group's growing unease. Colonel Horace Blakely, his military bearing strained by agitation, took it upon himself to lead the investigation, pacing the hall with the precision of a drill sergeant. "We'll find the truth, by God," he declared, his scar twitching as he glared at the others. His first discovery came during a search of the guest rooms, prompted by his insistence that no stone be left unturned. In Dr. Arthur Thorne's room, tucked beneath a folded shirt in his suitcase, he found a handkerchief stained with dried blood. "Explain this, Doctor," Blakely demanded, holding it aloft like evidence of treason. Dr. Thorne, his lean face paling, stammered, It's from a nosebleed last week, I swear. The cold air, you see." His trembling hands betrayed his nerves and the crumpled telegram in his pocket. A demand for payment on gambling debts seemed to weigh heavier in the accusing silence. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the handkerchief's monogram. Not Thorne's initials, but an indistinct H. Curious, she thought, her needles clicking faintly. A clue or a distraction? Lady Evelyn Harrington, her raven hair now pinned haphazardly, seized the moment to deflect attention. "I saw Mr. Langdon near the dining room display last night," she said, her voice trembling with calculated fragility. "The dagger was there during dinner. Then it was gone." Her green eyes flicked to the young artist, whose tousled hair and paint-stained fingers gave him an air of careless charm. Mr. Julian Langdon's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Nonsense," he said, his voice light but his eyes sharp. "I was sketching by the fire all evening." "Ask Bessie." The maid, hovering with a tray of scones, nodded hesitantly, though her wide eyes suggested uncertainty. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the dining room, where the dagger had hung among other antiques, a collection of swords, shields, and curios mounted on the wall. She recalled its ornate hilt, etched with vines, and the way it had caught the candlelight during dinner. Who had the opportunity to take it, she wondered, her fingers pausing on her knitting. The display was near the table, accessible to all, but the room had been bustling with Bessie's comings and goings and Mr. Snowgate's refills of port. Another clue surfaced when Colonel Blakely, undeterred, searched the snow outside the inn, braving the storm's bite. He found footprints leading from the back door to the edge of the moors, faint beneath fresh snow. "The killer escaped this way," he declared. But the trail ended abruptly, swallowed by drifts. Miss Marple, peering from the window, noted the footprint's shallow depth. Too light for a fleeing murderer, she thought. Perhaps a servant fetching wood before the storm worsened? She filed the observation away, suspecting a red herring meant to mislead. In Lord Harrington's room, now a grim shrine to the crime, Miss Marple examined the scene with care. The blood-stained carpet, the shattered monocle, and the dagger were undisturbed, but a torn scrap of paper in the victim's pocket caught her eye. It read, "Pay, or your secret is out." The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged. A blackmail note, but to whom was it addressed? Dr. Thorne paled when shown the scrap, muttering about business dealings, while Colonel Blakely laughed it off. "Harrington was always stirring trouble," he said, though his scar twitched. Miss Marple tucked the paper into her memory, noting its ambiguity. A clue, or another distraction. Miss Clara Vickers, the secretary, became the next focus when Mr. Langdon pointed to her notebook, left briefly on the table. "She's always writing in that thing," he said, his tone teasing but pointed. "What secrets are you hiding, Miss Vickers?" The mousy woman flushed, clutching the notebook to her chest. "It's just work," she whispered, but a page slipped loose, revealing cryptic shorthand. "Debts paid. Freedom soon." Colonel Blakely seized on it, accusing her of plotting against her employer, but Miss Vickers insisted it referred to business accounts. Miss Marple, peering over her spectacles, thought, "Shorthand hides truths as well as it reveals them." As accusations flew, tensions rose. Lady Evelyn wept, her handkerchief now sodden, while Mr. Langdon sketched the group, his pencil strokes sharp and deliberate. Dr. Thorne's fingers drummed nervously, and Colonel Blakely's pacing grew erratic. Mr. Snowgate, standing by the fire, muttered about the inn's reputation, his gruff demeanor cracking under the strain. Bessie, clearing plates, whispered to Miss Marple about a melted candle stub she'd found by Harrington's window. Its wax dripped in an odd pattern. "Thought it was the storm's doing," she said, her voice quivering. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the hearth's ash smudge, now joined by this new clue. "Wax and ash," she mused. "The smallest things tell the loudest stories." The group's search for answers grew frantic, each clue muddied by doubt. A missing earring of Lady Evelyn's was found in the corridor, but she claimed it fell during the night. A note in Harrington's handwriting accusing an unnamed guest of theft surfaced in the dining room, but its authenticity was questioned. "He was always writing nonsense," Colonel Blakely scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, noted the note's fresh ink, too fresh for a document supposedly penned days ago. By midday, the hall was thick with mistrust. Lady Evelyn accused Mr. Langdon of jealousy, citing his attentions to her. He countered that she'd encouraged him, her flirtations a spark in the gloom of her marriage. Dr. Thorne snapped at Colonel Blakely for his relentless probing, while Miss Vickers retreated into silence, her notebook a fortress. Mr. Snowgate, weary of the chaos, growled, "This inn's seen storms, but never a mess like this." Bessie, hovering at the edges, whispered of hearing a thump at midnight, but insisted it was the wind rattling the shutters. Miss Marple, her needles clicking steadily, let the accusations swirl around her. She observed the way Lady Evelyn's tears dried too quickly, the defensive hunch of Dr. Thorne's shoulders, the way Colonel Blakely's scar seemed to pulse with his temper. Mr. Langdon's sketches, glimpsed briefly, included a portrait of Harrington, too detailed for a casual acquaintance. Miss Vickers' shorthand hinted at more than accounts, and Mr. Snowgate's frequent trips to the cellar raised questions. Clues are like stitches, Miss Marple thought. Some are loose, some tight, but all part of the pattern. As the storm raged on, the waystation felt smaller, its walls closing in. The group's unity frayed, each guest a suspect, each clue a potential lie. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the candle wax, the ash smudge, the torn note, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The truth lies in what's overlooked, she thought, her mind already threading the needle of deduction through the fabric of deception. Chapter 5. Entangled Webs. The afternoon cast a pale gray light through the Snowgate Waystation's frosted windows, the blizzard outside softening but still fierce enough to block the roads. Inside, the great hall felt stifling despite the cold, as suspicion thickened among the stranded guests. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, remained unsolved, and the absence of the constable left the group to grapple with a growing web of clues, red herrings, and secrets. The fire in the hearth roared, but its warmth did little to ease the chill of mistrust that settled over the oak table, where teacups sat abandoned, and the air hummed with tension. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her high-backed chair, knitted quietly, her blue eyes darting from one guest to another. Her needles clicked with a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the chaos unfolding around her. Colonel Horace Blakely, his scar twitching with barely contained frustration, continued his self-appointed role as investigator, his pacing wearing a path in the rug. "We're getting nowhere with these half-truths," he growled, his military bark cutting through the murmurs. Lady Evelyn Harrington, her raven hair now loose and her pearls clutched tightly, dabbed at her eyes with a sodden handkerchief, her grief seeming more performance than passion. Mr. Julian Langdon, the artist, sketched restlessly, his charcoal strokes sharp as he eyed the group. Dr. Arthur Thorne, his mustache twitching, clutched his doctor's bag, while Miss Clara Vickers, the secretary, hunched over her notebook, her pinched face a mask of anxiety. Mr. Elias Snowgate, the inn's proprietor, loomed by the fire, his white beard bristling as he muttered about the stain on his inn's name. The search for answers grew more desperate as new complications arose. Colonel Blakely, undeterred by earlier false leads, insisted on a second sweep of the guest rooms. In Dr. Thorne's bag, tucked beneath a stack of medical journals, he found a small vial of cyanide. A poison, not a medicine. The room fell silent as he held it up, his gray eyes blazing. "Care to explain this, Doctor?" he demanded. Thorne's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he stammered, It's medicinal, used in minute doses for heart conditions, perfectly legitimate. But his voice cracked, and the telegram in his pocket demanding payment for gambling debts seemed to pulse with accusation. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, noted the vial's label, faded as if handled often. A doctor's tools can heal or harm, she thought, filing the clue away. Miss Vickers, under pressure from the group's accusing stares, broke her silence with a confession that tightened the web. I forged documents for Lord Harrington, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Business papers to cover his losses in bad investments. He threatened to expose me if I refused. Her hands shook as she clutched her notebook, its shorthand pages now a ledger of her complicity. Colonel Blakely pounced, accusing her of murdering Harrington to silence him, but she shook her head frantically. I was loyal despite everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, noting the desperation in her voice. Loyalty can bind as tightly as fear, she mused, wondering what else the notebook hid. A startling twist emerged when Mr. Langdon, his charm fraying, admitted to a secret liaison with Lady Evelyn. We were in love, he declared, his eyes locked on her. We planned to elope once she inherited. Lady Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her pearls, but her denial lacked conviction. It was nothing serious, she insisted, though her blush betrayed her. The room erupted in murmurs as Colonel Blakely revealed a bombshell. Harrington changed his will last month. Evelyn gets nothing. His estate goes to a distant cousin. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, shattering Lady Evelyn's composure. Her sobs turned sharp, and Mr. Langdon's face darkened, his sketchbook snapping shut. Miss Marple, observing the shift, thought, love and money make dangerous partners. The investigation took a darker turn when Miss Marple, exploring Harrington's room, discovered a hidden compartment in his suitcase, cleverly disguised behind a false panel. Inside were a handful of glittering jewels, emeralds and sapphires, their facets catching the dim light. Were they stolen or part of Harrington's dubious dealings? Dr. Thorne, when shown the gems, muttered about colonial ventures, while Mr. Snowgate's eyes widened, hinting at recognition. Miss Marple noted the jewels' weight, too light for true gems. Fakes, perhaps, she wondered, her mind turning to Harrington's reputation as a swindler. The discovery deepened motives. Theft, blackmail, or betrayal could have driven the killer's hand. Another scream pierced the hall as Bessie, the maid, stumbled in, clutching a crumpled note. I found it in my room under the door, she cried. The note, scrawled in jagged ink, read, Leave or you're next. The guests exchanged wary glances, and Colonel Blakely declared it a threat from the murderer, meant to scare them into silence. But Miss Marple, examining the paper, noted its similarity to the torn blackmail note from Harrington's pocket. A red herring or the killer's mistake, she thought, her needles resuming their rhythm. Bessie, trembling, admitted she'd heard footsteps near her room at midnight, but fear had kept her silent. Tensions boiled over as accusations flew. Lady Evelyn pointed at Miss Vickers, calling her a scheming clerk with a grudge. Vickers' mosaic. Vickers fired back, accusing Lady Evelyn of manipulating Mr. Langdon to do her bidding. Mr. Langdon, in turn, accused Dr. Thorne of using his medical knowledge to stage the murder, while Thorne snapped that Langdon's flirtations gave him motive. Colonel Blakely rounded on Mr. Snowgate, questioning his frequent cellar trips. What are you hiding down there, man? He demanded. Snowgate's face reddened, but he growled, Just checking the stores. This ends my life. Miss Marple, silent amid the chaos, pieced together the clues. The cyanide vial, the forged documents, the fake jewels, the threatening note, all threads in a tangled web. She revisited the crime scene in her mind. The ash smudge on the hearth, the melted candle wax by the window, the locked door with the key inside. The wax drippings, she noted, formed a deliberate pattern, as if melted to serve a purpose. The ash suggested someone had been near the chimney. An impossible crime requires an ingenious mind, she thought, her eyes lingering on the suspects. The group's alliances shifted like the snow outside. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon drew closer, their whispers intimate. Dr. Thorne and Colonel Blakely traded barbs, their tempers fraying. Miss Vickers retreated into her notebook, her silence louder than words. Mr. Snowgate's gruffness masked a growing unease, his glances toward the cellar door betraying him. Bessie, serving tea, whispered to Miss Marple about a faint smell of smoke in the corridor at night. Another clue or another distraction? As the afternoon faded, the storm's howl softened, but the roads remained blocked. The waystation felt like a pressure cooker, its walls closing in. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked, her mind weaving a pattern from the chaos. The truth is buried deep, she thought, but every lie leaves a trace. The jewels, the notes, the wax, the ash, each a stitch in the fabric of murder waiting for her to pull the thread that would unravel it all. Chapter 6. Fractured Alliances. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through the Snowgate Waystation's frosted windows, casting a pallid glow over the great hall. The blizzard outside had softened to a persistent flurry, but the roads remained impassable, trapping the guests in a cauldron of suspicion. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, loomed over them, its mystery deepening with every revelation. The fire in the hearth roared, its warmth mocked by the cold distrust that permeated the room. The oak table, littered with cold teacups and half-eaten scones, bore witness to the fraying tempers of the stranded travelers, each a suspect in an impossible crime. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles clicking with steady precision, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The group around her, Lady Evelyn Harrington, Mr. Julian Langdon, Dr. Arthur Thorne, Colonel Horace Blakely, Miss Clara Vickers, and Mr. Elias Snowgate, shifted uneasily, their earlier unity shattered by accusations and half-truths. The air was thick with tension, the crackle of the fire punctuated by sharp words and wary glances. Bessie the maid hovered at the edges, her apron twisted in her hands, her eyes wide with fear as she darted between serving duties and whispered confessions. The web of motives grew more tangled as new secrets surfaced. Dr. Thorne, his lean face drawn and his mustache twitching, broke under Colonel Blakely's relentless probing. "Fine, I'll admit it," he said, his voice cracking. "I had an addiction, morphine, years ago. Harrington lent me money to cover it, but he held it over me like a noose." His trembling hands clutched his doctor's bag where the cyanide vial had been found. "He threatened to ruin my practice if I didn't pay up." The confession hung heavy, and Colonel Blakely's scar twitched as he leaned forward. "Blackmail's a fine motive for murder," he growled. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, noted the desperation in Thorne's eyes. "A man cornered can be dangerous," she thought. But is he clever enough for this? Colonel Blakely, not one to escape scrutiny, faced his own reckoning when Lady Evelyn, her voice sharp with accusation, pointed to his scar. "You never forgave Reginald for Bombay, did you?" she said, her pearls glinting as she leaned forward. Blakely's face reddened, his fists clenching. "That scar," he said, his voice low, "came from a duel, yes. Over Harrington's lies. He called me a coward, cost me my career, but I settled that score honorably years ago." His gray eyes burned, and Miss Marple observed the way his hand hovered near his pocket where a small knife, military issue, bulged faintly. "Honor can mask vengeance," she mused, her mind turning to the dagger in Harrington's chest. Mr. Snowgate's alibi, previously unchallenged, cracked under Miss Marple's gentle questioning. "You were in the cellar often last night, Mr. Snowgate," she said, her tone mild but piercing. "What kept you there?" The innkeeper's white beard bristled, his gruff demeanor faltering. "Checking stores, as I said," he muttered, but his eyes darted to the cellar door. "Storm like this, we need supplies." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "An innkeeper's duties are many," she thought, "but so are his opportunities." She recalled Bessie's mention of a smoke smell in the corridor, perhaps tied to the cellar's coal stove, or something more sinister. A new clue emerged when Miss Marple revisited Harrington's room, her keen eyes drawn to the window. The snow outside was undisturbed, but a thin layer of ice on the windowsill glistened oddly, as if melted and refrozen. "Most peculiar," she murmured, noting the candle wax drippings nearby, their pattern suggesting deliberate application. The ash smudge on the hearth, now dusted with fresh soot, hinted at activity in the chimney. An impossible crime is only impossible until the method is seen, she thought, her mind tracing the contours of a daring plan. The group's alliances fractured further as accusations escalated. Mr. Langdon, his artist's charm wearing thin, accused Miss Vickers of jealousy. "You hated Evelyn's place in Harrington's life," he said, his sketchbook snapping shut. "You wrote those cryptic notes to plot against him." Miss Vickers, her pinched face flushing, shot back, "You're one to talk, sneaking about with her behind his back." Her notebook clutched tightly held shorthand that Miss Marple suspected concealed more than business dealings. Lady Evelyn, her composure crumbling, accused Dr. Thorne of using his medical knowledge to stage the locked room. "You know how to kill silently," she said, her voice trembling. Thorne's retort was sharp. "And you know how to manipulate men like Langdon to do your bidding." Chaos erupted as the group turned on each other. Colonel Blakely barked at Snowgate, demanding access to the cellar. "What's down there? Weapons? Evidence?" Snowgate's refusal only fueled suspicion. Bessie, clearing plates, whispered to Miss Marple about a faint creak she'd heard from the attic at midnight, distinct from the storm's clamor. "Thought it was rats," she said, her hands trembling. Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding the attic to the puzzle. Every sound tells a story, she thought, her eyes lingering on the ash and wax. To test her suspicions, Miss Marple requested private interviews, conducted in the dining room's quiet corner. She spoke first with Lady Evelyn, whose tears dried quickly under scrutiny. "You and Mr. Langdon planned to elope," Miss Marple said gently. "But the changed will disrupted that, didn't it?" Evelyn's eyes widened, but she admitted nothing, her pearls clicking nervously. Mr. Langdon next was less guarded, his sketches revealing coded notes, not love letters but cryptic references to payment and freedom. An artist's hand can hide many secrets, Miss Marple thought. Dr. Thorne's interview revealed inconsistencies. He claimed to have been asleep at midnight, but Bessie had seen him in the corridor. Colonel Blakely admitted to pacing the halls, unable to sleep, but denied entering Harrington's room. Miss Vickers, her voice barely audible, spoke of years of humiliation, her shorthand a diary of resentment. Mr. Snowgate last grew evasive about the cellar, his gruffness masking unease. Each interview added a thread to Miss Marple's tapestry, but the pattern remained elusive. A startling discovery came when Miss Marple examined the dining room's antique display. The dagger's empty mount was flanked by other weapons, a sword, a mace. But a small gap suggested another item had been removed. Something else was taken, she thought, her eyes scanning the room. Bessie, questioned again, recalled a small brass tool like a fire poker missing from the hearth. "Could have been moved during cleaning," she said. But Miss Marple suspected otherwise. The tool, if heated, could explain the melted ice on the windowsill. The group reconvened, their tempers fraying. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon whispered conspiratorially, while Dr. Thorne and Colonel Blakely traded accusations. Miss Vickers retreated into silence, and Mr. Snowgate's glances toward the cellar grew frequent. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, pieced together the clues: the ash smudge, the melted ice, the missing tool, the coded sketches. The killer planned carefully, she thought, but every plan leaves traces. As dusk settled, the storm's lull brought a false hope of rescue, but the roads remained blocked. The waystation's walls seemed to close in, the fire's glow casting shadows that mirrored the guests' fears. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving a pattern from the chaos. The truth is near, she thought, but it hides behind one final deception. Chapter 7. The Unraveling Thread. Evening descended over the Snowgate Waystation, the blizzard outside reduced to a soft flurry, its flakes drifting lazily against the frosted windows. Inside, the great hall was a crucible of tension, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows across the oak beams and faded tapestries. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, remained a puzzle, its pieces scattered among clues and red herrings. The guests, trapped by the snow and their own secrets, gathered around the heavy oak table, their faces drawn with suspicion and fear. The absence of the constable left them reliant on their own wits, and on Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet presence belied the sharpness of her deductions. Miss Marple, seated in her high-backed chair, set her knitting aside, her blue eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. The group, Lady Evelyn Harrington, Mr. Julian Langdon, Dr. Arthur Thorne, Colonel Horace Blakely, Miss Clara Vickers, and Mr. Elias Snowgate, watched her warily, their earlier accusations now tempered by the weight of her calm authority. Bessie, the maid, hovered near the fire, her apron twisted in her hands, her eyes darting nervously. The air was thick with anticipation, the crackle of the fire, the only sound as Miss Marple rose, her voice soft but commanding. "Let us reconstruct the events," she said, her tone warm yet deliberate, like a village gossip unveiling a scandal. "The truth lies in the details, and I believe we have enough to see it clearly." She began with the red herrings, dismantling the distractions that had clouded the investigation. "The bloody handkerchief in Dr. Thorne's room," she said, glancing at the physician whose mustache twitched nervously. "A nosebleed, as he claimed, but planted to cast suspicion. The monogram H was not yours, doctor, but a clumsy attempt to implicate you." Thorne's shoulders sagged, relief mixed with fear. Miss Marple turned to the torn note in Harrington's pocket. "Pay, or your secret is out." "A blackmail note, yes," she said, "but written in haste, its ink too fresh to be old. A diversion, meant to point us in circles." The group stirred, their eyes narrowing as Miss Marple continued. "The footprints in the snow leading nowhere were another false trail," she said, nodding to Colonel Blakely, whose scar twitched. "Too light for a fleeing killer, likely left by Bessie fetching wood before the storm worsened." Bessie nodded, her face pale. "The threatening note in Bessie's room, 'Leave or you're next,' was in the same jagged hand as the blackmail note. Another ruse to sow panic." Miss Marple's voice slowed, each word deliberate. These were not mistakes, but calculated misdirections by a mind desperate to hide the truth. She turned to the crime itself, the locked room, the dagger, the sealed windows. Lord Harrington was stabbed in his room, the door bolted from within, the key in the lock, the windows snowbound and latched. An impossible crime at first glance. She paused, letting the tension build. But let us consider the method. The dagger, taken from the dining room display, was accessible to all during dinner. A distraction, perhaps the clatter of dishes or a spilled glass, allowed the killer to slip it away unnoticed. The guests exchanged glances, recalling the chaotic meal with Bessie's bustling and Mr. Snowgate's frequent refills of port. "The locked door," Miss Marple continued, "is a classic trick. The killer used a string, threaded through the keyhole to pull the bolt from outside after the deed, leaving the key in place. A simple but effective deception often overlooked. Colonel Blakely nodded grudgingly, familiar with such tactics from his military days. "But the windows," she said, her eyes gleaming, "posed a greater challenge. Snow piled high, no footprints, no signs of tampering. How did the killer escape?" She gestured to the hearth, where the ash smudge had caught her eye from the start. "The chimney," she said, her voice rising slightly. "The killer descended through the chimney, a narrow but passable route for a determined person. The ash smudge, fresh soot not old, tells us someone used it that night." Mr. Snowgate's face darkened, his hand tightening on the fire poker. "The chimney leads to the roof, where the killer exited briefly, then re-entered through the window." The group gasped, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "The window was sealed, yes, but the melted ice on the windowsill and the candle wax drippings reveal the method. The killer used a heated tool, likely the missing brass fire poker from the dining room, to melt the ice, sealing the window, allowing it to open briefly. After exiting, they applied the candle's heat to refreeze the snow, resealing the window and leaving no trace." She paused, her eyes scanning the stunned faces. A clever plan requiring both nerve and precision. But who? The group leaned forward, their breaths held. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice grew firm. "Let us consider the true clues. The ash on the hearth, the wax by the window, the missing poker. These point to someone with access, opportunity, and a motive deep enough to risk such a daring act." She turned to Dr. Thorne, whose hands trembled. "Your debts, Doctor, and Harrington's blackmail gave you reason, but your shoes, clean of ash, suggest you did not climb the chimney." Thorne exhaled, his relief palpable. She looked at Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon, their faces pale. "Your affair and hopes of inheritance were strong motives, but the changed will left you with nothing. Your sketches, Mr. Langdon, hid coded plans, but not for murder, only for escape." Langdon's shoulders slumped, and Lady Evelyn's pearls clicked nervously. Colonel Blakely's scar twitched as Miss Marple's eyes met his. "Your grudge from Bombay was real, but your honor, however bruised, kept you from such a calculated act." He nodded stiffly, his fists unclenching. Miss Vickers, clutching her notebook, shrank under Miss Marple's gaze. "Your years of humiliation and forged documents gave you cause, but your fear of exposure kept you cautious, not bold." Finally, Miss Marple turned to Mr. Snowgate, whose gruff demeanor had cracked. "You, sir, had motive, Harrington's unpaid debts to your inn, and opportunity. Your frequent cellar trips hid your preparations, and the smoke Bessie smelled came from a coal stove you used to heat the poker." The room fell silent, Snowgate's face ashen. "But the chimney," Miss Marple said, "required agility you lack. The true killer needed both cunning and physical daring." She paused, her eyes settling on the group as a whole. "The clues point to one among us, but the final piece, the why and the how, requires one more step." She suggested a search of the attic, where Bessie had heard a creak. "The roof access lies there," she said, "and perhaps the final clue." The group, reluctant but compelled, agreed, their alliances shattered as they followed her lead. As they climbed the creaky stairs, Miss Marple's mind raced. The ash, the wax, the poker, the creak, all threads in a tapestry of murder. "The killer is close," she thought, "and their mask is slipping." The fire's glow faded behind them, the waystation's shadows deepening as the truth drew near. Chapter 8. Hidden Motives Exposed. Dusk settled over the Snowgate Waystation, the blizzard outside reduced to a soft patter of snow against the windows, though the roads remained impassable, chaining the guests to their shared fate. The great hall, once a haven of warmth, now felt oppressive. its oak beams and faded tapestries looming like silent judges. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, had woven a web of suspicion, and Miss Jane Marple's deductions had begun to unravel it. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the guests gathered around the oak table, their eyes darting with unease. The air was thick with the weight of secrets, each revelation tightening the noose around the killer. Miss Marple, seated in her high-backed chair, set her knitting aside, her blue eyes gleaming with quiet resolve. The group, Lady Evelyn Harrington, Mr. Julian Langdon, Dr. Arthur Thorne, Colonel Horace Blakely, Miss Clara Vickers, and Mr. Elias Snowgate, watched her intently, their earlier bravado replaced by a tense anticipation. Bessie, the maid, lingered near the fire, her apron knotted in her hands, her face pale with fear. Miss Marple's voice, warm yet deliberate, cut through the silence. "We've dispelled the distractions," she said, her tone as soothing as a fireside tale. "But the true motives lie deeper, hidden in the shadows of greed and betrayal." She began with the jewels found in Harrington's suitcase, their glittering facets now revealed as fakes. "Lord Harrington was no mere businessman," she said, her eyes scanning the group. "He was a swindler, passing off glass as gems in his colonial dealings. Someone among us knew this secret, and it drove them to murder." Mr. Snowgate's beard twitched, his hands tightening on the armrests, while Miss Vickers' pinched features grew paler. "The jewels were a motive not for theft, but for revenge," Miss Marple continued. "Someone he cheated sought retribution." Miss Vickers, under the weight of accusing stares, broke her silence. "I knew about the fakes," she admitted, her voice trembling as she clutched her notebook. "He forced me to forge certificates for them, to deceive investors. I hated him for it, but I was trapped. My family depends on my wages." Her confession hung heavy, and Colonel Blakely's scar twitched as he leaned forward. "You had reason to kill him, then," he said, his voice gruff. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Miss Vickers' fear kept her obedient, not murderous, she thought, noting the woman's trembling hands. But her knowledge deepens the motive. Mr. Langdon's sketches, previously dismissed as artistic whims, drew Miss Marple's attention next. She requested to see his sketchbook, and he handed it over reluctantly, his charm fraying. The pages held not only landscapes but coded notes, scribbled in the margins. "These are not love letters," Miss Marple said, holding up a sketch of the moors with numbers tucked among the lines. "They're plans for blackmail, aren't they? You discovered Harrington's fraud and demanded payment." Langdon's face darkened, his paint-stained fingers clenching. "I only wanted what was fair," he muttered. "He owed me for a commission he never paid." Lady Evelyn gasped, her pearls clicking as she distanced herself from him. Miss Marple thought, "Blackmail is a dangerous game, but is it murder?" The storm's lull brought a faint hope of rescue, but the group's tension only grew. Colonel Blakely, pacing restlessly, demanded a search of the attic as Miss Marple had suggested. The group ascended the creaky stairs, their footsteps echoing in the dim corridor. The attic, reached by a narrow ladder, was a dusty maze of crates and cobwebs lit by a single lantern. Among the clutter, Miss Marple found a small brass tool, the missing fire poker from the dining room, its tip blackened as if heated. "This melted the ice on the windowsill," she said, holding it up. The group murmured, their eyes darting to Mr. Snowgate, whose cellar trips had raised suspicion. "I never touched it," he growled, but his unease was palpable. A new twist emerged when Bessie, trembling, pointed to a crate in the attic's corner. Inside, hidden beneath a tarp, was a coil of thin rope, strong enough to support a person's weight. "The chimney descent," Miss Marple said softly. "This rope allowed the killer to lower themselves into Harrington's room, stab him, and climb back to the roof." The group's faces paled, the method now clear but the culprit still elusive. Dr. Thorne, his mustache twitching, muttered about acrobatic nonsense, but his trembling hands betrayed his fear. Back in the hall, accusations flared anew. Lady Evelyn, her composure cracking, accused Mr. Langdon of using her to get to Harrington's wealth. "You never loved me. You wanted his money," she cried, her voice sharp. Langdon's retort was bitter. "And you used me to escape a tyrant." Colonel Blakely rounded on Dr. Thorne, citing the cyanide vial. "You had the means to kill quietly," he barked. Thorne snapped back, "And you had the motive with your old grudge." Miss Vickers, silent until now, whispered, "It's all lies. Everyone's hiding something." Mr. Snowgate, his gruffness fading, muttered about the inn's ruin, his eyes fixed on the cellar door. Miss Marple, her mind weaving the clues, noted a startling discovery. A faint trace of ash on Dr. Thorne's cuff, overlooked until now. "You were careful, Doctor," she thought, "but not careful enough." She recalled Bessie's mention of a smoke smell in the corridor, tied to the attic's proximity to the chimney. The rope, the poker, the ash, all pointed to a meticulous plan, but one clue stood out. A cup of tea served to Miss Marple earlier had a bitter aftertaste. Testing it discreetly, she found traces of sedative, not enough to harm, but enough to slow her deductions. A red herring meant to dull my senses, she thought, her eyes narrowing at the group. The group's alliances fractured further as panic set in. The storm's easing meant the constable might arrive soon, and the killer's time was running out. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon drifted apart, their whispers silenced. Dr. Thorne clutched his bag, his face ashen, while Colonel Blakely's pacing grew erratic. Miss Vickers' notebook remained her shield, its shorthand a mystery yet to be cracked. Mr. Snowgate's glances toward the cellar grew frantic, as if hiding more than supplies. Miss Marple, her needles clicking faintly, pieced together the puzzle. The fake jewels revealed Harrington's deceit, fueling motives of revenge and blackmail. The rope and poker explained the locked room. The ash and wax confirmed the chimney descent. The sedative in her tea was a desperate act to slow the investigation. "The killer is cunning," she thought, "but their fear betrays them." She proposed one final gathering, to lay out the evidence and name the culprit. The group, exhausted and wary, agreed, their eyes locked on her with a mix of dread and hope. As night fell, the waystation's shadows deepened, the fire's glow casting eerie patterns. Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving the threads of ash, wax, rope, and deceit into a pattern that pointed to one person. "The truth is close," she thought, "and it will not stay hidden much longer." Chapter 9. The final confrontation night had fallen over the Snowgate Waystation, the blizzard now a faint whisper, its snowflakes drifting softly against the windows. The roads remained blocked, but the promise of the constable's arrival loomed, sharpening the urgency in the great hall. The fire cast a warm but uneasy glow across the oak beams and faded tapestries, illuminating the strained faces of the guests gathered around the heavy oak table. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, had woven a tapestry of suspicion, and Miss Jane Marple's deductions had brought them to the edge of revelation. The air was thick with anticipation, the crackle of the fire mingling with the rapid breaths of the suspects. Miss Marple stood, her slight frame commanding the room with quiet authority. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The group, Lady Evelyn Harrington, Mr. Julian Langdon, Dr. Arthur Thorne, Colonel Horace Blakely, Miss Clara Vickers, and Mr. Elias Snowgate, sat in a tense circle, their earlier accusations silenced by the weight of the moment. Bessie, the maid, lingered near the door, her apron twisted in her hands, her eyes wide with fear. "We have all the pieces now," Miss Marple said, her voice warm yet deliberate, like a storyteller unveiling the final chapter. Let us weave them together and name the killer. She began with the crime's mechanics, her words slow and precise. Lord Harrington was stabbed in a locked room, the door bolted, the key inside, the windows sealed by snow and ice. The dagger taken from the dining room display was a weapon of opportunity slipped away during the chaos of dinner. She gestured to the table where memories of that meal, Bessie's bustling, Mr. Snowgate's port refills, lingered. The killer used a string through the keyhole to bolt the door from outside, a classic trick. But the chimney was the true path, as the ash smudge on the hearth revealed. The killer descended with a rope found in the attic, stabbed Harrington, and exited via the window. The group leaned forward, their faces pale. The window's ice was melted with a heated brass poker missing from the dining room and resealed with candle wax to mimic a snowbound seal, Miss Marple continued. The rope, the ash, the wax, the poker, these are not guesses but facts, pointing to a meticulous plan. She paused, her eyes scanning the group. But motive is the thread that binds it all. Harrington was a swindler, his fake jewels a secret that fueled blackmail, revenge, and betrayal. She turned to the motives, her voice softening but unyielding. Lady Evelyn, your affair with Mr. Langdon and hopes of inheritance gave you reason, but the changed will left you empty-handed. Lady Evelyn's pearls clicked as she shrank back, her eyes avoiding Mr. Langdon's. Mr. Langdon, your coded sketches planned blackmail, not murder, to reclaim a debt Harrington owed you. Langdon's hands clenched, his charm gone. Colonel Blakely, your Bombay grudge was real, but your honor, however scarred, kept you from this crime. Blakely's scar twitched, but he nodded stiffly. Miss Vickers, Miss Marple said, her gaze gentle. Your forged documents and years of humiliation gave you cause, but your fear of exposure made you cautious, not bold. Vickers clutched her notebook, her pinched face trembling. Mr. Snowgate, your unpaid debts from Harrington stung, and your cellar trips hid something, but your strength could not navigate the chimney's narrow path. Snowgate's beard bristled, his eyes darting to the cellar door. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Dr. Arthur Thorne, whose lean frame seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. Doctor, your motive runs deepest, she said, her voice firm. Harrington blackmailed you over a malpractice death. A patient lost years ago covered up to save your reputation. He demanded payment you couldn't afford with your gambling debts mounting. Thorne's mustache twitched, his hands gripping his doctor's bag. Nonsense, he stammered, but his voice cracked. The evidence points to you, Miss Marple said, her tone unwavering. The ash on your cuff, unnoticed until now, came from the chimney descent. The wax on your sleeve matches the candle drippings by the window. The brass poker, heated in the cellar's coal stove, where you were seen late at night, melted the ice to open the window. You descended the chimney with the rope, stabbed Harrington, exited to the roof, and resealed the window with the candle's heat, leaving no trace. She held up the poker, retrieved from the attic, its blackened tip damning. The sedative in my tea was your final mistake, a desperate attempt to slow my deductions. The room froze, all eyes on Thorne, his face drained of color, his trembling hands betraying him. You can't prove it, he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were relentless. Your bag held the tools, surgical precision for the stab, knowledge to stage the scene. The blackmail note in your jagged hand was meant to mislead, but its ink matched the threatening note to Bessie. You planned every detail, but the ash and wax betrayed you. Thorne's shoulders slumped, his bag slipping to the floor. He was a monster, he said, his voice breaking. He'd have ruined me, exposed the death, taken everything. I had no choice. The confession spilled out, raw and ragged. I waited until midnight, used the rope to climb down the chimney, stabbed him, and left through the window. The poker melted the ice, the candle resealed it. I thought it was perfect. He collapsed into his chair, head in hands, as the group stared in stunned silence. Colonel Blakely rose, his military bearing restored. "You'll answer for this, Thorne," he said, his voice gruff but shaken. Lady Evelyn's tears were silent now, her pearls still. Mr. Langdon's sketchbook lay forgotten, his face pale. Miss Vickers clutched her notebook, relief mingling with horror. Mr. Snowgate's gruffness softened, his eyes on the fire. Bessie, trembling, slipped away to fetch tea, her fear replaced by awe. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. Human greed and fear are so predictable, she thought, her eyes lingering on Thorne's broken form. The fire's glow cast long shadows, the waystation quieter now, its secrets laid bare. The constable's arrival was imminent, but the mystery was solved, the killer unmasked by the smallest traces. Ash wax in a bitter cup of tea. As the group dispersed, their alliances shattered. Miss Marple's mind was already turning to her journey home. The truth always surfaces, she thought, like a stitch pulled tight. The waystation, once a haven, now felt hollow, its walls echoing with the weight of justice served. Chapter 10. Dawn of Justice. The first light of dawn crept through the frosted windows of the Snowgate Waystation, painting the great hall in hues of pale gold. The blizzard had dwindled to a gentle flurry, and the distant rumble of a snowplow signaled the constable's imminent arrival. Inside, the air was heavy with the aftermath of revelation. The fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers that cast faint shadows across the oak beams and faded tapestries. Lord Reginald Harrington's murder, a dagger to the heart in a locked room, had been solved, its intricate web of clues unraveled by Miss Jane Marple's quiet brilliance. The guests, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief, sat in a subdued circle around the oak table, the weight of truth settling over them like the snow outside. Miss Marple, her slight frame wrapped in a sensible woolen shawl, sat calmly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her scarf. Her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, surveyed the group. Lady Evelyn Harrington, Mr. Julian Langdon, Colonel Horace Blakely, Miss Clara Vickers, and Mr. Elias Snowgate, with a gentle but knowing gaze. Dr. Arthur Thorne, the confessed killer, sat apart, his lean frame slumped, his doctor's bag at his feet like a discarded shield. Bessie, the maid, moved quietly, setting out fresh tea with trembling hands, her eyes still wide with the shock of the night's events. The hall, once a crucible of suspicion, now felt hollow, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple's voice, warm and deliberate, broke the silence. "Every crime leaves traces," she said, her tone as soothing as a fireside tale. "And it is in the smallest details that the truth reveals itself." She recounted the final threads of the mystery, tying up the loose ends that had entangled them. "Dr. Thorne's motive was rooted in desperation," she said, glancing at the physician whose head hung low. "Lord Harrington's blackmail, threatening to expose a malpracticed death, pushed him to act. His gambling debts left him no escape, and so he crafted a meticulous plan." She gestured to the clues that had betrayed him. The ash on his cuff came from the chimney where he descended with the attic's rope to reach Harrington's room. The brass poker, heated in the cellar's coal stove, melted the ice on the windowsill, allowing him to exit and reseal the window with candle wax, mimicking a snowbound seal. The string through the keyhole bolted the door from outside, a classic deception. The group nodded, their earlier doubts dispelled by her clarity. "The sedative in my tea," she added, her lips pursing slightly, "was a final, desperate attempt to slow my inquiries, but it only confirmed his guilt." Colonel Blakely, his scar no longer twitching, spoke up, his voice gruff but respectful. "You've a mind like a steel trap, Miss Marple," he said. "But what of the red herrings, the handkerchief, The notes, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Planted distractions, she said. The bloody handkerchief was meant to implicate Dr. Thorne too soon, drawing attention from the true clues. The blackmail note, pay or your secret is out, and the threat to Bessie were in his hand, meant to sow chaos. Even the footprints in the snow, too light for a killer, were a servant's errand misread as evidence. Lady Evelyn, her raven hair pinned neatly now, clutched her pearls, her face pale but composed. "And my inheritance?" she asked, her voice soft. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Your hopes were dashed by the changed will, but your affair with Mr. Langdon was no murder plot. Only a dream of escape." Mr. Langdon, his sketchbook closed, nodded silently, his charm dimmed by the truth. Miss Vickers, clutching her notebook, whispered, "I thought I'd be blamed with those forged documents." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Your fear bound you, Miss Vickers, but it did not drive you to kill." Mr. Snowgate, his white beard bristling less fiercely now, cleared his throat. "My inn's name is tarnished," he said, his voice heavy. "But I'm glad it's over." Miss Marple nodded. "Your cellar held no secrets, only your pride in this place." She turned to Bessie, who hovered with a teapot. "Your keen ears, my dear, helped more than you know. The smoke, the creak, the thump, all pointed to the truth." The rumble of the snowplow grew, louder, and soon a heavy knock echoed through the hall. Mr. Snowgate opened the door to reveal the local constable, a stout man bundled in a greatcoat, his face red from the cold. "Heard there's trouble," he said, stamping snow from his boots. Colonel Blakely, taking charge, recounted the crime and Thorne's confession, his military precision guiding the narrative. The constable listened, his eyes widening as Miss Marple added her concise summary, her voice carrying the weight of undeniable logic. Dr. Thorne, his resistance gone, stood as the constable approached. "I've nothing more to say," he murmured, his hands cuffed behind him. "Harrington would have ruined me. I thought I could outsmart you all." His eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of awe in their depths. "I was wrong." The constable led him out to a waiting sleigh, the snow crunching underfoot as the Waystation's grim chapter closed. The remaining guests dispersed, their alliances broken but their burdens lighter. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Langdon parted ways, their dreams of elopement shattered by the will's truth. Colonel Blakely, his honor intact, spoke of returning to his quiet life, his scar a reminder of battles past but not present. Miss Vickers, her notebook tucked away, vowed to find new employment, her spirit bolstered by Miss Marple's kindness. Mr. Snowgate began cleaning the hall, determined to restore his inn's reputation. Bessie, wiping tears, whispered her thanks to Miss Marple, who patted her hand gently. As the sun rose higher, melting the snow's edges, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to depart. The constable had arranged a carriage to take her to the nearest station, her visit to her nephew Raymond delayed but not forgotten. Human greed and fear are so predictable, she thought, her eyes lingering on the Waystation's weathered walls. But so is the truth, when one knows where to look. She stepped into the crisp morning, her shawl tight against the chill, and boarded the carriage. The moors stretched before her, their white expanse softening under the dawn's light. Every village has its secrets, she mused, and every secret its solver. The Waystation faded behind her, its story complete, its justice served. And that's our tale, dear listeners. Thank you for joining me in Marple Parlor for this snowy mystery. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe and share your favorite moment in the comments. Who did you suspect and what clue caught your eye? Until our next adventure, stay curious and keep your eyes sharp, just like Miss Marple.